so happy to see you all. It's January 11th, 12 p.m. Eastern. So this is our second call in this year, 2023. I'm just so grateful that you came because it tends to be a little bit more difficult in winter to have the same routine as we do throughout the year. But you made it. Hi, Lucy, waving. So as usual, this is a place for sharing, getting together, healing in the midst of others, continuing the journey that you're taking as you learn throughout the training. It just, I would like to make it very clear that as you go through the case studies in your GTR training, those case studies are, of course, they're not just for you to learn from in terms of the techniques and the method and the processes and all that. They are, of course, intended for you to also uncover and discover where you yourself might need some healing. In fact, one of the questions that goes with every case study that you're invited to reflect on is what kind of challenges would there possibly potentially be for you if you were the practitioner in this particular case study? And in most of your replies and most of our students' replies, it's not just a matter of technique. Oftentimes, you uncover the triggers that are personal to you. So, for example, if there's a case study where the client lost a loved one, of course, if you lost a loved one, then that might be a trigger for you if you haven't healed something in there for yourself. The same with painful breakups, or some of the clients deal with either loved ones or people close to them with mental health challenges, and that's another trigger point often when in your life somebody close to you had a mental health challenge. And sometimes it's not just the question of having compassion for that person, but sometimes that could have been a trauma for you. If you think of the session with Jeannie, her mother does seem to have some kind of mental health challenge, some kind of personality disorder. And it's not just a matter of Jeannie is sad for her mother that she cannot help her. This presents a lot of difficulties for Jeannie. So I guess what I'm trying to say, as you go through the case studies, please don't think that you should not be quote unquote triggered. That if you are, then that's an opportunity for you to uncover that. And number one, help yourself on the way towards becoming a certified practitioner, but also to get yourself to a place where you will be able to be present to the client in a more pure state. So I hope that makes that clear. As always, I will try to just highlight some things in the beginning of this session, and then I'll open the floor to sharing questions and all the rest. And I'm so happy to see some of you who don't always come or who didn't quite make it in our last sessions. So the thing that I thought I would bring up is, let me just open this for a second so I don't forget. Some of the questions that students sometimes have difficulty with, or something that they need to master as they go through the training and then through the practice, is what event to work on in a given session. And this is a question that sometimes is a bit different for the very first session and sometimes different for the other sessions. So let me first talk about it a little bit when it comes to the first session. I said in the notes, I try to give you some helpful kind of markers to help you determine what kind of event would be an optimal candidate to clear in the first session. Because there are more and less optimal candidates, i.e. traumatic memories, to clear in the very first session. So if you're a little bit lost or you don't know, if perhaps there are clients that have a lot going on and there's so much in their holistic well-being check-in, that was the case for Anna as an example. So one of the good candidates would be looking at the symptom that they brought up. And if there's a symptom that is especially pressing at the time they show up for your first session, that might be a good candidate. To give you a practical example, let's just say somebody started to have panic attacks and it's relatively recent. So that is quite a pressing issue. It's a rather uncomfortable situation to be in, because somebody with panic attacks, they never know when those panic attacks are going to hit, and to the people experiencing them, it feels like they're going to die when they have that experience. So that is a pretty pressing problem. So that might be a good example of a candidate. At other times, it's something that emerged relatively recently, and that recently is relative. It doesn't have to be last week and can be in the last year, for example, but it's a symptom that the client didn't used to have, and now it's here. A typical example would be sleep issues. I know that there are case studies in your training that some of the clients have had those sleep issues for a longer time, say Angelica, but we know why she has them. It's very much related to her breakup. But then there's Marcus as an example. Right in the first module, Marcus can't sleep. And that's not usual for Marcus, that he's not able to sleep. So we're looking at that as a recent symptom. Now, another sort of hint letting you know that that might be a good candidate for you to look at in your very first session is when something is readily available for the client on the emotional level. So this would be the case of, for example, from dip to divorce. Becky comes in very distressed. Recently, she started experiencing these uncontrollable crying episodes whenever the dip is mentioned. And she very much knows that that's what it's related to. And that is the most accessible to her emotionally. And it doesn't really matter that she is aware that that dip is connected to an event from her past. She is not so much responding or so intensely responding to what happened to her in the past. It's in the now when she looks at the husband and God forbid, he has something in his hands that might look like he's dipping or about to. So that is more readily available to her emotionally. And finally, if and that's what we're ultimately looking for in the first session, is if you can find that one-off event. That's always your best bet, and that's what we're after in the first session, very ideally. This is often, if there was an event in your client's life that perhaps was an accident, or they were being robbed or attacked, and it's not a series of events. It's not, they work at a place or say in a bank, and the bank got robbed several times. It's just really a one-off when that sense of safety or physical integrity was compromised. Then that is also a very good indicator. I proceeded in this way with Anna in the very first session. Anna got robbed. And she had a lot going on, but this was one that I call it choose an event in the first session that doesn't have tentacles that go into other events in your client's past. And this one for Anna was a good example of that, because the other memories on her list in her holistic well-being check-in were instances of abuse or instances that gave her this feeling of everybody's betraying me, nobody is supporting me, everybody is against me. Well, that robbery, even though still traumatic, it stood out a little bit in that it wasn't so much about betrayal, it was more about a sense of safety. So it was different from all those other memories that had this common thread of I'm not being supported here, everybody. She even says that everyone who could betray me did betray me. And she projects this from individual people in her life to institutions, to communities, and actually to the whole society. She even says that in one of the sessions. So why do we want a one-off event? I'm just repeating this. It is because in that first session, we want the client, number one, to start trusting the efficacy of the GTR method. We want them to know that this works. And if they were able to do it once with one memory, they will be able to do it for their other memories. If you pick a memory that is relatively easy to clear, then also they become comfortable with the process. And thirdly, we really want them to feel motivated right from the get-go. We want them to understand that even though this is trauma, which inherently is not fun to deal with, it's not like what they might have perhaps heard of being in therapy, and it takes a very, very long time to heal, if you even heal. We want them to have that immediate sense of relief right in the first session, so they know that this is doable. If you choose the one-off event right, if you choose the event for the first session right, then you should be able to apply the basic recipe to it. Usually the basic recipe alone is enough for a well-chosen event like that. If not, you can complement it with the emotional release recipe. But in an ideal world, whenever possible, we want to show the client, take the client through the basic recipe in session one, just so they also can do it in between sessions. In session number two, we want to add the emotional release recipe to the mix. And again, in an ideal world, session three, finish and complete, sometimes name and protect. That doesn't mean that you cannot apply them in earlier sessions that if that's necessary. But normally, and in most cases, if you follow the steps, this would be probably the most frequent scenario. Let me just see if there's anything else that I wanted you to know and add to this. Okay, so let me also say this from the other end. So I said what the ideal candidates would be. Another way to look at this would be what do you want to ideally avoid in that very first session? So first of all, it would be those big caliber memories. Why? Again, because we want that immediate release, we want the trust, we want the comfort, we want the ease. That's how the process is set up. So big caliber memories, the ones that you know, that's one of those quote unquote original wound traumas. Even if you see them, leave them for later sessions. What you also, in most cases, want to avoid are events from a more distant past, right, from the childhood, past that was a long time ago. Why? Because those tend to be the more core, deep, traumatic memories. Now, on the bright side, those tend to be the ones that hold the more long-term symptoms in place. And if you don't clear them in session one, of course, don't worry, you will get to them. That's how the process is set up. That's why we have the client fill in the emotional freedom plan, and there's a process behind this. So usually a memory from a distant childhood is also not the greatest candidate. And then, of course, you want to start clearing the memories that you clearly see that they're connected to many others, because that doesn't give you a very high chance that you would be able to get that memory to a 0 in the first session. And I just have found over time that if you manage to get the memory down to 0 or to a comfortable 1 for the client, it's just a slightly different experience than when you kind of leave it half open. And, with this method, why not? Why not do that if we know how to? You have the tools that most of the time it will be possible for you to do that, to get a memory all the way down to 0. And in an ideal world, that's the goal, to take care of 1 memory per session and clear it completely, not to leave it half open, half hanging, so that the client has to come back the next session and you still talk about the same memory. if that happens, and it can happen, if you're starting or if you're learning or you're not still comfortable or something like that, it's not that you cannot pick up where you left off in the next session and it's fine in the beginning. Just know that as you grow, as you learn, in the ideal optimal world, you want to bring that down to a zero or clear it as much as one can clear it. And what I mean by that, if there's a name and protect element, because the threat is still present, of course, you wouldn't be pushing for that memory to go all the way down to zero, but just take care of it to completion. Okay. And finally, ongoing traumas, so abuse, things like that. Also, those are better to be left for later sessions. I'll just remind you that when it comes to that, in those later sessions, when there were traumas that were part of a more of an ongoing experience, that we work with that prototype memory. I'll get back to that in one of our virtual office hours and go deeper. I just wanted to use that as a reminder. Great. So that's on my end, a little bit of a recap. Saying things from a slightly different angle, I find is very often helpful. And if there's anybody who would love to share something or say something, it's helpful for me if you can raise your hand. I'm just going through you looking. Yes, there you are, Donna. Ask to unmute. Hi.
Hi, how is everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm gonna go back a little bit to last week where we talked about some of the emotions when we were talking about defining emotions, and some people found it hard, like me, to define their emotions. I was reading where there are six basic emotions, and so there's fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, disgust, and anger. That those were the six basic emotions, and that everything else that people feel is a combination of those. So I guess I just kind of wanted you to talk about that a little bit, like how in the world do you figure out what their basic emotion is if like everything's a combination of those six? It just if
Yes.
only people just use those six, it'd be great, but they don't. They use,
Yes.
a ton of
Yes.
other expressions.
I absolutely understand your dilemma around that, and let me explain. So the way this term came to being, these basic emotions, is when psychologists were doing research, trying to look into emotions and trying to figure out if emotions are something that we are born with or if it's something that we learn culturally. Um, and some of the earliest research went like this. They they took pictures of humans, and in those pictures, they were expressing certain emotions. So they had pictures of somebody being angry and frowning, and somebody, with their eyes like a deer in the headlights, fearful and shocked, and then somebody smiling, and then somebody just being disgusted, and others. And they took those pictures to different places on Earth, even to more indigenous communities where they knew that they couldn't have been exposed to certain cultural element and social elements the way other countries were. And what they found out, what psychologists found out, was that no matter whom they showed those pictures to, they were these six emotions that everyone could name them. Everyone could tell, okay, this person in this picture is angry. The person in this picture is feeling disgust and joy and sadness. So that's how that name, basic emotion, came to be. Now, that doesn't mean that there are only those emotions, or not even that all other emotions are a combination of those. It just means that it seems like, because they're so universally recognizable, even without the social cultural input, it seems like these are emotions that we are born with. That's what it's all about. And if there are emotions that we are born with, it means that there is an evolutionary value to those emotions, like any trait that is repeated across generations in one species. And that brings me back to when we were talking about personality. So, for example, if you think of that extroversion personality trait, that would be those positive emotions that motivate you to get what you need or want. And I don't mean just any like convoluted goals and fulfilling your ambitions, but even simple things like an organism being fed, looking for food, or drinking, or procreating, etc. So you need to be able to feel something that motivates you to move forward. And at the same time, if you look at neuroticism, that's just the opposite. That's just being able to access emotions that hold you back a little bit so that you can avoid danger. So it seems like those six tend to fulfill some kind of evolutionary value that helped us survive as a species. And then on the other side of the coin, we have so-called social emotions. And the emotions that belong to this category are, for example, shame or guilt. So babies don't seem to be born with a sense of shame or guilt, but we can observe in them sadness, happiness, disgust if they smell something. Disgust is a funny one. And there's definitely a very strong evolutionary advantage to that, because sometimes poisons, we don't see them or hear them. And our only way to tell that we are in a toxic environment is through our sense of smell. Funny enough, it's also the emotion of disgust also seems to be very related to one of the 5 personality traits, one that we didn't talk about in last year, and it's conscientiousness. So last year we talked about extroversion, neuroticism, and agreeableness, and conscientiousness as a personality trait is composed of 2 subcategories. It's industriousness and orderliness. And the funny thing is that the same way as we can perceive disgust when there is something toxic, not good in our environments, we can recognize that a food is not good for us anymore. Our sense of morality also seems to be connected with the emotion of disgust. So something that helps us determine our own behavior, or when we're judging the behavior of others, it's the emotion of disgust. We're disgusted by their behavior, by the way they think, or ours. When we don't do something, it's because we would be disgusted by ourselves if we did, or if we acted and thought in some way. Does that make sense, Donna? Sorry, I don't hear you.
Yes, thank you for clearing that up. I wasn't sure of what that really meant when I read that. I thought just 6 emotions, impossible. I've heard so many others. Yeah,
Yes, so
okay.
so that's what it's meant. That kind of older psychology research.
Okay.
That's what they meant by basic behaviors. But it definitely pays to widen your emotional repertoire, and I mean this both by vocabulary and experience. In fact, I'm thinking of what kind of new lectures, classes, and exercises to add to the program to help you with that, because a lot of students bring this up, that when they watch these case studies that feature the emotional release recipe, that sometimes their repertoire is not wide enough. And I don't think that emotions necessarily have to be a combination of those 6, but it is true that sometimes when you watch a client during the emotional release recipe, sometimes what you see in their face is a combination of both. Sometimes the combination of, I would say I see both shock and disgust. And that might be true, that two of them show up at the same time. And what you do in those instances like that, you just ask them to pick the one that is more prominent, the one that they connect with more, and go with that. Thank you. That was an excellent question. Okay, let me just see. Taryn joined us. Mary Elizabeth, hi. Are you feeling better? Hope so. If you want to talk, just raise your hand. And
I'm feeling a little better, but not not better yet.
yes, yeah, there's the cough still. Yeah, there's it's everywhere. I don't know if it's nothing their head. Yeah, it just seems like after COVID, the flu and all the rest. I flew during these holidays, and I was glad that I was wearing a mask. It wasn't for COVID. It was just everybody was coughing left, right, in front and behind, both staff and clients. So you don't have to talk. We're happy just that you're here with us and listening. And Lucy, how are you doing? Did you want to share anything? You were nodding your head when you were
Good,
talking.
thank you. I realize though how important the emotional repertoire is, and how I think in my own life, certain traumas kind of like locked me into predominant states of emotion that would be kind of like my go-to, not recognizing that they were actually a pattern of trauma. So it's one thing to, be able to, feel fear, say surprise or happiness, but how close is anger and rage or disgust? You get angry, or even anger to sadness. If you feel like, not you, I'll phrase it in terms of myself. So when I felt angry, could I also drop into a state of helplessness? And so I find it interesting in the videos, though, how, when I watch them and I see the facial expressions, and someone will go from this smile to all of a sudden their face is scrunched. So what happened that like interrupted the joy, let's say, or this moment of reprieve from whatever predominant emotion might be lingering? And I think my experience has been a lot of people were not actually, and I don't mean educated as in going to school, but even as children, were you raised in a family or in a situation where you could identify emotions without being ostracized or criticized for that? Or did you associate certain responses with different emotions? And as I do my own discovery work on a regular basis, I go, okay, so, and firsthand experience, my mother was not comfortable with anger. It would tip her to mental illness. So anger was just verboten. It was like, you're not going there. What's wrong? Don't do that. So then all of a sudden anger became bad. I'm just using anger as an example. And so it's like, oh, I didn't understand, well, why is anger bad? But it's what I unconsciously assumed and took in, only to then later explore, anger can be like a stop point for, I'm not letting anyone cross my boundaries beyond, say, a certain point. So how else could anger be framed and felt, or was and interpreted? Because was I interpreting it as good, bad, right, wrong? What if it can be all of those and be interpreted in a myriad of ways by different people? So it perpetually brings me back to the point of, the more you know yourself, or I know myself and my triggers, and broadening my perspective as to how others, even if I don't know, but how could others have experienced a certain emotion, in what kind of circumstances in their life, I feel that I enhance my compassion for listening and being in a neutral, non-judgmental state, because so much is possible.
Yeah, and just out of curiosity, to make this more practical, what emotions, for example, do you find that you gravitate towards, whether they're quote unquote negative or positive, that are more of your default setting, and which ones are harder for you to read or you don't experience them that often. And the reason why I ask is for everybody to understand that this might be very different for you than it will be for Lucy.
Mhm. Yeah, so true. Which ones do I gravitate to? Well, I know an example that pops in my head, and I would love to hear from anyone here. What are your experiences? So I was terrified of conflict, because conflict for me looked as if I could potentially be life-threatened in the circumstance of my mother being in a violent breakdown. So to me, conflict, I will not now, but used to avoid at all costs. So then I became agreeable and I would acquiesce, and I could be extremely cheerful. Do I like being cheerful? Absolutely, but not as a cover up for being not okay with disagreeing. And it's okay to have a discourse, and yet it's been a teasing out for me of various things. So how does that resonate with any of you? Is there somewhere that you think, oh, wow, this is a great quality, I'm really cheerful and bubbly and blah, blah, but really, I'll be just happy if nobody disagrees with the thing I say, or else I'll get quiet or whichever. So
if I'm hearing you correctly, then you're saying that when you get distressed, and that's one of the differences amongst people, is that when we get distressed, we will not respond in the same way with the same emotions. So for you, it could have been the fear, the panic, the hypervigilance, the being on guard, etc. While, for example, if I get distressed, I would gravitate more towards, well, if it's not that intense, it would be irritation, irritability, frustration, impatience, and then all the way to being more angry. Another person still can be disappointed, resentful. Another person can be worried. I'm worried sick that something bad will happen to my loved ones, etc. So that's what I was curious about. What do your emotions tend to be? Because that's how you widen that emotional repertoire for yourself, becoming, okay, these are my more or less default emotions, but what else is out there? This is why I love the 5-element theory in Chinese medicine. It opened my eyes to so many other ways of being. You have, every element has a certain emotion attached to it, the one that is typical for that element. So, for example, the water element would be related to that fear that makes you freeze, that paralyzes you. But then on the other side of that, when the water element is in balance, you have trust, because that's almost the opposite of being paralyzed by fear, by the unknown. So there's trust, and there's wisdom, and there's creativity. Those are the virtues of the water element. Or say, take another one, fire. That would be the shock, not freezing in a way like water does, but being shocked to the point that you begin to stutter, and you are scattered, and your attention is everywhere. But then on the other side of it, there's that vibrancy of joy and awe. That's fire. So I can see Taryn and Moraine raising their hands. I would be very curious to hear about your experience so that we learn something from that. Hi, Taryn.
I was supposed to be on this call. I've been working on my emotions the past week. I'm doing a special project, and what came to me as early as last night and this morning was that all of our emotions are important, the good ones and the negative ones. And if we don't allow them in, we close down. If you can imagine our house, if we start closing rooms down, and so our house that we're living in gets smaller. And I really visually see this picture. And so when I was going through trauma, I remember sitting on my bed and seeing myself over here. And when I called myself back in, I knew I had to, once I got back into my body, all those emotions had to be there, because if they weren't, I would be over here. And so I've been learning to allow them all in and let the bad ones kind of flow through me. Like I feel them and I allow them and I acknowledge them and I understand the message, or if there is one, sometimes it's just me being angry or being upset or frustrated. And then I let it flow through. And now I work at keeping the positive ones there longer than the negative ones. And so the space between the negative and the positive is much shorter. And in some of my research, I learned that you can change your emotion within 16 seconds. And so I just knowing that a person with trauma is sitting over here and she wants to be in here, even the little girl, all of that has to be here. It's so amazing to me now that even anger, I had a discussion yesterday and I wasn't angry. I was probably more frustrated, and I was able to communicate that in a very loving way because I didn't ignore the anger. I spoke it, but I spoke it in a very loving way. And it's I just can't believe I'm on here listening to this right now.
And if I may, if for example, you with your personality, if you get distressed, what emotions do you usually experience? And then when you feel good, what are the emotions that you usually experience?
I think when I'm usually feeling hurt, and then it's that I've done something wrong, or I've said something wrong, or I didn't do something right. That's usually what the bad stuff, that's when the negative stuff comes in. And so I usually feel like I'm not good enough. I didn't do a good job. I don't know what I'm talking about. On the happiness side, I feel this overwhelming love now for the universe, for the people that I know. No, there isn't one person in my life that I don't love, even if there's problems between the two of us. It just is, because I finally came to the understanding that my self-worth and my self-happiness is more important than anybody else's, because I can't be my best if I don't think I am my best.
Yeah.
So my words are joy and happiness and not pride, comfortable with who I am, comfortable in my body. I have this tremendous belief in my life and what's happening in my life and how it's working for me. And I literally have no, I'm so in my body. And
It's just to put words around what you're saying, and that's how I perceive you as well. So
uh-huh.
when you're a bit distressed, so the emotions that might be more frequent visitors in your case could be a sense of doubt or self-doubt, guilt, that sort of thing. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there would be joy, there would be optimism, there would be
Mhm.
hopefulness and faith. Faith.
Yes, very much, very much.
Yes. And
Yep.
so for somebody like you, and there's no right and wrong answer for this and that, did you find that there are certain emotions that other people experience and that they are hard for you to understand?
Oh,
Because yeah,
I'll tell you the biggest one that I've just learned about, because I didn't understand the power of it, is anxiety. The debilitatingness of anxiety. And one of my closest friends, who we're not connected right now, we're having trouble in our relationship. I mean, we communicate, but we're not the way we were. She deals with anxiety, and I didn't understand the level of that and how it affects her as a person. So
yes.
anxiety, big one. My husband had anxiety, and I didn't even know it until he had cancer. But he lived with anxiety the whole entire time we were married, and I had no idea.
Yes, thank
So,
you. That is exactly why I was asking this question, and that was such a great example. And this one was also more difficult for me to understand. So just to give you another example of how important this is to know yourself, because then you will also understand the other side of the story, the emotions that are more difficult for you to understand because you don't experience them regularly, perhaps never have. Anxiety was also like that for me. And I remember there was someone in my family. They had a lot of work piled up at work, a lot of projects that needed to be finished, etc. And for someone who doesn't experience anxiety a lot or doesn't have enough experience with it, it might look like, why don't they just sit down and do the work and take it step by step? And it used to be very difficult for me to understand when this person said, I am just so anxious that I cannot work. And they would do everything but the work. And funny enough, I understood the power of anxiety when um, I'm more of a tea drinker, but at one point I just got bored with tea. So I bought some coffee and started to drink a little bit of coffee. And because I didn't have enough experience with coffee and my body wasn't used to it, at one point I had too much coffee. And and it created anxiety in my body, almost to the point of panic, all that caffeine. And it wouldn't let go for almost a day. And that's how when I realized, okay, this is what it feels like. This is what anxiety feels like. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, there will be emotions like this for you as well. That if you don't have an experience with them, try to explore them, perhaps by talking with people who experience that kind of emotion. Ask them what that's like, and get to know that emotion. And that's one way of widening your emotional repertoire. Definitely a good one with the emotional release recipe. Thank you, Taryn. I'm going to Moraine, and then Lucy raised her hand as well. Moraine, try to unmute yourself if you can. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hey.
First, thanks, Isabella, for talking about the first session, because I'm just about to launch my first practice client. But anyway, let's go back to emotion. I didn't realize the power our family background brings. I feel I came from a family that dissociated both my mother and father from any emotion. And so even there wasn't a lot of joy. And my sister had the most joy and most emotion. And I was considered was a high strung because I was the youngest of four and more emotional than all of them. Plus I was adopted. So I just find it so interesting, like in relationships with men, we're all women here, and women have been socialized, I think, to have a more understanding of our emotion, and where and yet men are so much more comfortable with things like anger, and so there's a very powerful side story going on with emotion in society, with our background and socialization. Just wanted to make that point.
Yes, and if you've been to some of our calls last year when we talk about agreeableness and women, that's what it was all about. The other side of the coin of agreeableness, especially related to women, is that anger is a no-no because it might make you appear disagreeable. So there's definitely a social aspect to that. Thank you. Cynthia, I'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Lucy. Because you didn't have your turn yet. Yes, there you go. Hi.
Hi, everyone. So there were lots of things that came up for me. For me, myself, I go into, I think, fear. That's my big response. But listening to the other ladies who spoke here, I was a school teacher for over 20 years. And one of the big things that I saw in schools is that we condition kids to not feel and not act on their feelings through punishment and isolation. And so, and in schools, we don't teach about emotions. We don't teach about being in your body. We don't teach about being heart-centered or being in yourself. We teach you to conform. And so I think that it starts really young. So we have it in our families, and then we have it in schools. And so I think that's a really important part when we look at what people feel, is that we're not taught about it. And then in my work with children and women, and especially women who've left domestic violence, one of the things that I found really helpful was an emotions wheel, the feelings wheel. And so that's a really great one to come back to for ourselves. So like you were saying, Isabella, to expand our emotions. I love those emotions and feeling wheels to look at and say, okay, what is this really? How could I expand it? The other thing I just wanted to say was, if nobody's familiar with Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart, she talks about how we have so few emotions we can name, but there's so many more. And I love how she described them and how they relate to each other, and she categorizes them. And then the last thing I just wanted to say was, in terms of the good and bad emotions, which again, we're taught in school to have that black or white around things. Heart Math, they do a lot of work around talking about emotions being depleting, energy depleting, or that they feed your energy in a good way. And so I think that's a nice way how they word it, because then it's not about good or bad. It's just about an experience that we feel again in our bodies.
Yes, thank you. And the reason why I use that terminology is just for simplicity, of course. I mean the energies that, sorry, the emotions that don't feel so good when we feel them. And of course, all emotions have value. Taryn asked the name of the book. It's called Atlas of the Heart, Taryn, by Brené Brown. And definitely, thank you, Cynthia. I will be adding the Wheel of Emotions to the training somewhere to help with the more nuanced. But just to go back to, so you find that the kind of emotion you gravitate towards in your case would be around fear.
Definitely.
Yes,
Fear
when
and
distressed.
doubt. Yeah, that's the go-to. But then I'm able to sit with it and sort of look at like, what's here, what does it relate to, going back to like my root cause, and yeah.
And the other side, if you feel you're feeling good, what kind of emotion do you often access?
Joy.
Joy, yes. Yeah, I thought so. You know, the 5 elements that I mentioned, you seem to have a lot of fire, and fire, that is, that is that the fire anxiety is the, what's happening? I start to stutter. It's like having, fear of public speaking, when, it's the dramatic kind of anxiety. It's not the long-term underlying anxiety. It's the shock. It's that sort of feeling. But then fire can also come down from that very quickly. Fire is, very much the movement of those emotions happens very dynamically. And yes, the virtue of fire is joy, the almost overbearing joy, the warmth coming from the heart, and the ability to make others feel at ease, because that warmth of the fire makes them feel special, and like they're the center of your attention, and also the emotion of awe, like the childlike awe for the world around you and the wonders of life and the world. So yes, that's definitely how I would perceive you as well. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Lucy, I'm coming to you, and then Donna.
Okay, very briefly, mentioning on like the wheel of emotions. A long time ago, I saw a chart, and it was all these little like one-line pictures of faces, and then all of these emotions. I wasn't even aware that the majority of those emotions even existed, but to see them in a picture was different than doing it with words. It shifted from an intellectual to a visual, and being able to recognize those expressions in others' faces. And so as a intellectual activity, I circled the ones that I was familiar with, and then I got playful and curious, which actually is an open brain state, to explore the other emotions that I was like, didn't know existed, and wondered, oh, well, what would that be like? Or what circumstances would that come up? And so forth. And for me, it was a great exercise in terms of expanding my own emotional repertoire, but also being able to recognize it in others based on expression or whichever, because a lot of people are not necessarily aware of what emotion they're feeling. Their body might be speaking something, but they're not sure what word or emotion to put to it. So
exactly, and more to the point that we were talking about a while ago, it's some of them will be so unfamiliar to you that you will have to sort of interview other people to find out more. I remember, and this is not specifically on emotion, but I have a friend who is also very fascinated by the 5 elements in the Chinese medicine, and he has a lot of the water element. I don't have so much of it. And the water element, one of the things that the water element can do is to be able to relax deeply. And that's something I have a little bit of difficulty with. And I remember it was the summer, and he sent me a message saying that he was sitting in his whirlpool outside and relaxing. And I remember asking me, how do you do that? Like, how exactly do you do that? What is going on in your head? What are you sensing with your body? Tell me a little bit more. And so he went on giving me more detail. He was saying, well, I'm just staying here and I'm thinking about nothing. I'm just paying close attention to the water touching my skin, to the bubbles, bumping into my body, to breathing the air. And so then I could find a reference point for that a little bit, even though my relaxation, it wouldn't necessarily look like his. But for me, this is what I experience when, for instance, I go for a run or for a bike. It is that wind in my face. It is that sweat and the drops of sweat on my forehead. It connects me with the body. And that's what I find relaxing. So sometimes you just have to go around and interview people to widen your repertoire. Okay, going to Donna.
Hi again. I just find that age affects very different from. I'm just going back to when I was in corporate work. My to-do list was my medicine. So if I felt overwhelmed, which often leads to frustration, the to-do list was my anchor, it was my grounding. I could start with something simple and tick it off and feel some satisfaction, say, okay, and then build up the momentum and get ready to tackle the more mundane or heavy stuff. And now I find that with age, though, that to-do list is not the medicine. I don't know what I seem to avoid. Avoidance seems to have come in. So I find that age definitely comes in. So if people have older clients, they will find that assigning a to-do list is probably because the overwhelm and then the frustration that kind of comes from that overwhelm of not just feeling overwhelmed, and that after a while you just avoid, you just find something else to do because you're just so
help me understand that a little bit. So when in your past you experienced a feeling of overwhelm, and just listening to Donna, we can already see part of her emotional repertoire. So it was the overwhelm, for example, and I would guess that's something that still might be one of the emotions that you access more often than others. And the to-do list would bring you comfort. It would soothe that overwhelm, make it less.
Yes.
And so you're saying that today you still experience overwhelm, but that to-do list is no longer a source
just one
of
more
comfort.
thing to do.
Okay.
Now it adds to the overwhelm because
Yes.
I got to do this to-do list, and I don't. You just You can't get there for some reason. So I don't know if it was the structure of the corporation, that kind of was there to kind of support you. And now working on your own or being on your own, you don't have that structure. You have the knowledge of the structure, and that's part of the solution. So I try to keep my day as structured as possible that way. But I just find that, even getting the to-do list down on paper can be overwhelming sometimes. But it's
And in your mind,
yeah.
what is
So
the
I'm just
opposite?
saying that, I
Yeah.
find that with age you have less. I don't know what it is. Urgency, maybe? I don't know what it is.
Yeah,
don't
well,
know.
it seems to create more stress for you
I don't
to
hear
do
you.
this.
Did I lose
Yeah,
you?
it looks
Does
like it.
everybody else? Okay.
Can
There
you
we go.
ladies hear me?
Yeah.
You hear me fine. Okay, well, it just seems to be adding to your stress, the to-do list today. And what
Yeah.
for you, what is the opposite of overwhelm for you?
Relief.
Oh, yes. That was accompanied by an
Yeah.
exhale, really.
Just
Okay.
relief. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you understand that a to-do list does not give you relief.
No, not anymore, but it used to.
Yes.
I kind of miss it, but at the same time,
Yeah.
it's something I had to just kind of let go of, because all I was doing was adding to the list. I wasn't
Yeah.
getting the work done. I was just adding to the list.
And just to make this clear, it might be that some people will still find comfort in a to-do list, and that might be the case of, for example, somebody who is naturally less conscientious than you are, and they never did the to-do list, or they were not disciplined enough to have a to-do list. For people like that, it might still bring them comfort to create this habit, but you don't need help there. You perhaps long for more freedom, or for the lack of pressure to have to stick to that to-do list. So there's that. To me, the opposite
You
of
got reframed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful point. And I'm going to Silvana. We didn't hear from you today. I don't know if you want to do video, Silvana. If you do, then try to turn your camera on. And if not, that's fine too. I think I can hear you.
Okay, here I am.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yes, I wanted just to comment on Taryn, the book that's coming together. I know I had added my name on the Excel spreadsheet, hoping that I would have something, but I don't. So I think I haven't coached and I don't have anything. So I should probably come off the list and maybe next time around. What do you think?
Yes.
I think
Yes.
if that's how you feel, then that's the decision you should make. But I am of the place that everybody has a story to tell, whether you've had a coach or not. So that's entirely up to you.
You know
Yes.
what? You just read my mind, because I actually thought I could tell my own story of how this is helping me. And I thought, but I think they want other people's stories, right?
No, I'm telling my
Yeah?
story.
Are you
Yes.
really? Oh, well, then keep me
Yes.
on the list.
Thank
Thank you.
You know, the day will come, ladies, when we just come here and we just sit and we'll read each other's minds. So we won't have to talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Isabel, I do have another question I wanted to
Yes.
ask you. So on the assignment, if that's okay, I don't know if we can talk
Yes,
about them,
go ahead,
but
please.
in clearing that old school memory where, oh, I can't remember her name. I have to look at my notes.
Alicia.
Alicia, that's right. She had this embarrassment where the teacher put her on the spot, and I handed in an assignment, and I made a claim that I too had that experience, and I actually had a few more, but I always feel like, oh, I'm in trouble if I do something wrong, or I speak up, or say the wrong thing. So is that something that I can do the emotional freedom technique around, this feeling of I did something wrong, or I'm in trouble, or, just having a voice?
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And let
Yeah,
me
yes.
start by saying that this is so very common. I
No.
mean, even in the, I'm going to be adding more case studies to the training, case studies where our students and today graduates coach other people.
Yeah.
And I think it's in all of them that all these clients bring in this element of having the fear to make a mistake, of doing
Yes.
something wrong, and then suffering the consequences of that. So first, I do want to acknowledge that it's nothing out of ordinary and very normal as a consequence of traumatic experiences in the past.
Mhm.
Now, the way to approach this, one of the strategies you could use, and
Yes.
Silvana, I would encourage you, if you can, work with somebody else. I know you mentioned in many of your assignments how much healing you got from watching the case studies and from reflecting, but I really do think that it would be so
Okay.
supportive of you if you have somebody to help you through this a little bit. Not that you can't see it yourself, it's just it leaves you more freedom to process your internal
Yes.
experience if there's another person guiding you through it.
So do you mean somebody on the gentle trauma or somebody
Yeah,
outside?
yeah, if somebody is doing their practice hours or they
Oh,
have done
okay.
them and they want to practice some more, you can post it in our Facebook group. But to answer your question, how to do that, ideally with somebody else, but for the
Yeah.
purposes of theoretically replying,
Okay.
there's something called the bubble process. I think I mentioned it in module 5 or 4 in the lecture note and lecture notes. And you can imagine that you draw a bubble on a sheet of paper and you put the symptom in the middle of that bubble. So it could be fear of making mistakes.
Yeah.
And then what comes up that is related to that symptom? So it could be, well, in year such and such, the teacher called me, I was standing in front of the whole classroom and I answered their question wrong and everybody laughed at me. Or it could be something, with my husband, I answered his question wrongly, or I looked at him wrong,
Yeah.
and there was a consequence.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
I tried to make things up so that I don't make things personal. And
Yeah.
sometimes it just
Yes.
is what it
No,
was.
but you're on the right track, Isabella. And because I think there were things, whether they were at school or in my home life, even growing up, we had to be a certain way, behave a certain way. And I know I might have talked about this, but my dad, he was bipolar and he would rage. He would get so mad, but he was a very loving guy when he was good. And then he would get so mad. So it was like walking on eggshells sometimes. So the agreeableness, that fear of doing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, being in trouble, and it's still lingering. So yeah, so I'm going to go on the Facebook and reach out and see if somebody would like to work with me. Sounds great.
Yes, please. And one small note to what you were saying. You first observed embarrassment in Alicia, and yet I think both in your assignment and today, you actually connected a different emotion to it for yourself. You said humiliated.
Oh,
So
I did. You caught that. I don't even remember saying it.
so they're slightly different. And so I'm just saying that for you, that if, for
Yeah.
example, you're looking for memories or something that resonated for you in watching or rather listening to Alicia's case study, I would be looking for events where you were or felt humiliated
Okay, that
rather,
makes sense.
rather than embarrassed. Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. That's great.
Yes.
Thank you, Isabella.
You're most
Thank you.
welcome. All right, ladies. So anyone else would like to say anything? Hands are all down. Okay, thank you. So I think we came to a natural close today. Thank you very much for coming to this call. And of course, we'll get back together in a week from now at exactly the same day and time. Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Bye-bye.